This is DGMT's Learning Lunch, and I'm your host, Rahima Asop. What are some of the ideas that have shaped your world in profound ways? For instance, the idea that human rights are inherent and universal has shaped our laws and how we are protected. Human rights are not things we can see, hear, smell, or touch, but we all agree that we all have them, because there is social and political consensus that we are all just born with them. Essentially, it's a powerful idea that we can rally around, build political will around. There's a common language we all use, and we can develop laws around this idea. To be honest, I can't think of another idea that is as powerful, considering it's a fairly new one. It was adopted in 1948. If you think about it, I'm being a bit facetious here, but if you think about it, cars, planes, and light bulbs are older than universal human rights. The point I'm trying to make is that ideas like the human rights example can be powerful heuristic devices that help us to make sense of the world. They can be strategic tools to craft political discourse or institutional frameworks embedded in our societies. So that brings me to today's topic. What makes a powerful idea? And more importantly, how do powerful ideas gain political traction and social support? This is what today's episode is all about, but we'll tackle this topic with practical examples from civil society organizations, of course, that have a strong policymaking and advocacy component to their work. Today, I'm joined by Tess Peacock, who is the Executive Director of the Equality Collective, and Phylicia Oppelt, Project Lead of Change Ideas, a DGMT initiative. If we look at the South African context, civil society has played a significant role in shaping policy and laws, often acting as a catalyst for change through advocacy, research, and direct engagement with the government. The most prominent example of this in post-apartheid South Africa is how the Treatment Action Campaign lobbied vigorously for the government to provide antiretroviral treatment to people living with HIV/AIDS in the early 2000s. The powerful idea driving this campaign was that access to ARVs is a fundamental human right, and the campaign was steeped in research and science. The efforts led to a landmark constitutional court ruling in 2002, which compelled the government to make ARVs available, significantly shaping South Africa's HIV/AIDS policy and saving millions of lives. Phylicia, the TAC example is a prominent one that we can draw lessons from, but there are many others. So I'm curious how you would describe the anatomy of a powerful idea in the context of social change, using examples from the South African context or abroad if you have them.
Thanks, Rima. I think the anatomy of a powerful idea is made up of several factors, and obviously it starts with clarity of purpose. It needs to be compelling, and this purpose needs to be easily understood, communicated, and focusing on a specific issue that resonates with the community and beyond. And just to go back to the TAC as an example, the TAC didn't operate in a vacuum. What it did was it extended itself and drew in local networks, NGOs, civil society. It employed a range of devices. So there were protests, there was significant media outreach. It was in the public domain consistently. And lastly, it included legal action. When you look back on it now, you can actually see the various steps the TAC took in order for massive social change to be enacted. For me, the TAC's example just clarifies how, if the purpose is significant, the call to action is also significant, and you bring in various factors, how you can actually effect long-term change, and that is what they did. At the height of the AIDS pandemic, to be able to mobilize such significant support and just massive communication on a local and international scale in the midst of a president dabbling in denialism. Because in a way, the TAC and the president, they were kind of the two poles. And that is what remains striking about that. And it was an issue that garnered emotional reactions as well. And I think that's vitally important. If I can just go to a more recent example, and I don't believe in South Africa certainly, we haven't seen a similar, sustained and long-term kind of movement to effect social change. There have been efforts. And if I think about in the context of GBV, I think it was in 2018, there was the total shutdown hashtag. I'm old, I forget to put the hashtag first. There were protests, there was a significant outpouring of rage in terms of gender-based violence in South Africa and the propensity of talking but no action. Those protests resulted in President Cyril Ramaphosa calling for a summit on gender-based violence. And more recently, you've seen kind of solutions coming out in terms of legislation being passed and a lot more attention being given. At the same time, GBV remains a horrific problem in this country. For the idea to be sustainable, you don't have a segment of it. You have a continuous call to action, and you draw on communities and you highlight the issue through a range of mechanisms. And I think a lot more could have been done in the GBV space if that moment became a sea change or a call. And you know, we would still have marches to Parliament. We would still have the faces of GBV out in the public domain, because one of the key issues here is persistent pressure as opposed to stop-start movements.
Thanks, Phylicia. That's really interesting. Tess, do you have anything to add on that?
On a personal level, I was at school when the Treatment Action Campaign was launching some of their major marches, and it was one of the first big marches that I took part in, and I think played a critical role just in my own individual politicization, I guess, and seeing the impact of what kind of movement building means and feels in the streets, and that kind of massive cross-class, intersectoral collaboration that was required in order to kind of pull something like that off. 20,000 people in the streets, and against, as Phylicia said, against this pole of AIDS denialism of the president at the time. But for me, the major learnings for the Treatment Action Campaign is when you take a step back and you look, it took 10 years to make some of the gains that were made, right? This isn't something that happened overnight, and it's not something that happened in 2 years or 3 years. It took 10 years, and it had multiple different phases, and it was agile, and it was flexible, and it was able to adapt to what was needed in order to achieve what it actually achieved. You don't go into this work thinking you're going to be adversarial. You only go that route when you need to. And I think that was also critical in terms of what emerged from the Treatment Action Campaign movement building. And as Phylicia said, they did it on multiple levels and strategies. There were international strategies, there were UN conferences, there were petitions, extensive government correspondence, but there was base building movement work, support groups set up across the country that actually met the needs of people living with HIV and AIDS, so that they also then mobilized to become activists on some of the issues. Often what's said is that if they just went to the courts alone and just had a technocratic or elitist win in the courts, that actually wouldn't have changed the stigma and the way that communities kind of accept and live and love people living with HIV and AIDS. And so amidst the AIDS denialism, there was an absolute essential sense that one needed to be on the ground in communities, movement building, changing people's perceptions, ideas, conspiracies, and all of that. And look where we are now. I mean, it's an unbelievable shift, and it's a sea change and a culture shift in the way that we treat people who are living with HIV and AIDS.
So just to sort of summarize the contributions from my two guests, this didn't happen overnight. It took up to 10 years, that the TAC didn't operate in a vacuum. There were other civil society organizations and individuals and bodies that were involved, that it involved mobilization. There was agility on the part of the TAC. So all of those things are really important. There was community mobilization. But I want to touch on one of the points that you made around storytelling and language and the use of the word injustice. Phylicia, It's really important, isn't it, to build a common language around a powerful idea if we are to mobilize different communities. How does one go about doing that?
How an issue is framed significantly affects how it's perceived. And if you frame an issue in a particular way, then those rallying behind it or working on that issue can highlight specific aspects that are most urgent and pressing to be resolved. And I think if we go back to the TAC, which seems to be the only kind of long-term sustained example, it had emotional resonance. The message was very clear. This is our lives. We are affected. It's not an out there issue. It's my brother, it's my sister, it's my mum, it's my friend. I mean, I remember doing a Southern African trip at the height of the AIDS pandemic with Love Life. And we visited 3 Southern African countries, South Africa, Mozambique, and Botswana. And the TAC's work became magnified for me because all you came across in various communities, very poor communities, was that people were dying. And so that's what the TAC kind of, their clear, unequivocal message was, and the way they framed it, we are dying and we need intervention. It's about crafting messages that have common denominators, which is I understand, you understand, we all understand, and we can all grapple with it, and we can all mount a response. Easy, understandable language is an invitation as opposed to creating barriers. As we spoke previously, that kind of message needs to have sustainability, needs to have long-term vision, it needs to be culturally and socially relevant, and there needs to be visible communication.
Thanks, Phylicia. Tess, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. From the neoliberal perspective, it's just a perspective, we assume that people are individualistic, and in order for them to care about an issue or rally around a powerful idea, they need to know what's in it for them and how it affects them. How does one then build a narrative or a common language when people are, in it for themselves?
So I think people are raised in particular families with value systems. Some are raised in kind of strict parenting contexts. Some are raised in kind of very communal, community-based contexts. There's a sense that you've got to help each other versus a pull yourself up by your bootstraps approach, right? And so we all have different value systems that help shape and how we see the world. And there's a lot of, I think, good research around value-based messaging. And when you speak to people's values, that's what kind of inspires people to act. And you also have to make it easy for them to act. And they've got to feel hopeful that when they act, something transformative is going to happen. And that is the story that you have to tell when mobilizing people around social change issues. And I'll give one example. In the long fight to achieve gay marriage equality in the United States, there was a long period of time where people spoke in the language of rights, that this is a right that people must have. And at one point, it shifted to this is actually about love and the obstacles around people trying to love each other in the way that they want to love each other. And when that narrative shifted to one of love, there was almost a sea change in terms of how people felt they could be activated on the issues and how people showed up in support of the issue. And they've got to feel it somewhere in the vibrations in their body that this is something that they care about. And I think that's the art of it, really. And it's possible, and we can definitely do it. And yes, we live in a context where people can seem to be very individualistic, but I think ultimately people really care about their communities, they care about their country, they care about trying to make the world better. And I think that's the kind of space in which we've got to occupy.
As they say, love is love. Tess, tell me a bit about the Equality Collective. The organization is based in the rural Eastern Cape. What is the Equality Collective trying to achieve?
So the Equality Collective was founded in early 2020. The fundamental theory of change is that collective power and building collective power is absolutely crucial to shift things and make political kind of changes, and particularly in contexts that seem quite like very, very difficult in terms of abject poverty, marginalization, etc., because we're based in a deep rural community along the Wild Coast in the former Transkei homelands regions. And the idea around the Equality Collective, we don't do stuff in our own name. We build collective power. We hold coalitions. We build movements. We sit at the nexus of grassroots work, deep grassroots work, but also trying to influence policy and be strategic and have systemic impact. We're a very unique organization because we're embedded. When our communities don't have water, we also don't have water. We're not sector specific. The idea is we're a community lawyering organization. How can we use the law as an overlay across multiple issues of poverty and inequality that can support our communities to advance and create a more kind of equal world and a just and caring society and communities? And so we sit at this nexus of grassroots and policy impact, very unique to an organization to do that. We work in an embedded way with communities. We try and do movement building, but we also recognize that we want to do strategic, systemic work as well and influence at the policy level. And so we straddle both of these kind of worlds essentially, and I think in a relatively short period of time have seen quite significant impact in the work that we do, and I think it's because of the kind of unique role we play and where we're based.
I'd like to hear a bit more about that. There have been some wins already. Perhaps you could share the story around Equality Collective's social mobilization campaign against the Children's Amendment Bill and how that has shaped the latest iteration of this piece of legislation, which is a draft law that could change the ECD early childhood development landscape for the better.
In 2020, the Children's Amendment Bill was tabled before Parliament. It was a piece of legislation that didn't fix any of the problems that the sector had been raising for the last 10 years and in many ways made them worse. It was quite a poorly drafted piece of legislation. And as the Equality Collective, because kind of our ethos and emerging ethos was around building collective power, we really thought that we could step in and support the sector in responding to this piece of legislation. And essentially founded together with other organizations like the Children's Institute, Ilifa Labantwana, DG Murray Trust, Equal Education Law Centre, Children's Institute, etc. We founded the Real Reform for ECD campaign. And the campaign was very much around resisting the Children's Amendment Bill. We mobilized over 1,600 submissions to Parliament across 7 provinces. 98% of those submissions came from ECD practitioners themselves. There were about 200 organizations who supported Real Reform for ECD's work in resisting that bill. We were very, very coordinated and organized. We made powerful submissions in the parliamentary portfolio meetings, and in the end, the portfolio committee made a decision to reject the ECD portions in the bill, ultimately leading to the portfolio committee chair suggesting that a technical team be set up to redraft the bill. And then we were, as Real Reform for ECD representatives, we found our kind of way onto this technical team that has been drafting the bill. A new version of that bill was published this year by the Department of Basic Education. There's still kind of a road ahead. It still must be tabled before Parliament and passed, and these things can take really long, but law reform work does take long, which was one of the points I was making earlier. But I think what was exciting for us was this mobilization that happened in response to the Children's Amendment Bill. The Equality Collective is an organization that's set up to kind of hold coalitions and provide backbone support. And so that was the role that the Equality Collective wanted to play in Real Reform for ECD over a kind of longer period of time. We saw our role as a kind of providing secretariat support, that's comms support, advocacy support, coordination support. And we set up a steering committee of 12 people, and that's the thought that went into like who sits on that steering committee, how do we make sure that it has the resources, the skills and the people needed to build a movement. So we have ECD practitioners, we have lawyers, we have network-based organizations, we have NGOs. So the steering committee is set up to ensure that it has the capacity to do the work. It's not just a free-for-all vote at an AGM. It's like, how do you make sure that you have the skills you need in order to get the work done? And so we were very deliberate about the terms of reference that was crafted for real reform. So we keep a coalition element on a steering committee level. You've got a backbone support and a secretariat that sits in Equality Collective that's resourced, that's lightweight. You leverage the kind of resources that are across these other organizations, so you make sure that you have broader impact. You build a broad base of people who support that. We've got over now 300 organizations supporting real reform for ECD. So you continue to build that broad base, and then you movement build. So we work with over 1,000 ECD practitioners throughout the year in workshops and engagements and consultations and sit-ins and marches and petitions. We're not taking on millions of issues. We have a stake in the ground on law reform, and that's going to be hard enough. You don't have to spread yourself thin and take on a million different issues.
Thanks, Tess. Whether or not an idea gets political support depends on its political currency, on its ideological basis, whether it has partisan support, economic value, and socio-cultural value. So there are a lot of factors at play that kind of would determine whether a good idea or powerful idea is picked up politically. Tess, from an ECD lens now, have you noticed any changes in how politicians or political parties are talking about early childhood development from what we saw in the last elections?
Absolutely. Just last year, we haven't done a complete review, but we were, just real reform for ECD alone had over 100 media appearances. And that was unheard of 4 years ago. Early childhood development was just not getting that kind of attraction in media attention. So I think there's definitely a bit of a kind of like a major shift happening. It's also viewed as an area where you can make real gains politically. And so I think there's a sense that we can actually achieve something here. So Treasury, for instance, is happy to kind of put money behind ECD. It's like one of the only areas where there's a growing budget. Yes, from a small base, but it's a growing budget in a time of kind of many, many shrinking budgets. And so definitely there's a change. And I think what I will say this about our movement building work and our advocacy is we employ multiple strategies. And one of the major strategies, and I think this goes to an earlier point around TAC, is relationships with government. They are absolutely critical to moving the work forward. So we sit on these technical teams and we engage in what we call a constructive advocacy. So the idea is that you come with the solutions and you try and find traction through relationships that you build in government. Most government officials are not recalcitrant, irrational beings. They're actually people who want to do their jobs and do the work that they do amidst it could be a failing local government amidst, various political shifts, poor resourcing, all of that. But most of the time you find someone on the other side who actually wants to do their job.
What does it take for an idea to gain political traction? I know this is a big question to answer, but if you can, what does it take for an idea to gain political traction?
I think that, you talk about government officials, then you talk about politicians. And I think we should make a distinction between the people who make things work and the people who say things about things that don't always work. I think everyone understands that you have to work with the government officials, the DGs, and those are the stayers. And the politicians are the players. And so if you can effect real influence with those DGs, with those head of departments, the guys who know what's going on in their own backyards. But I think it's a very complicated process, and I think Tess could speak to it much more and from an experiential point of view than me being the cynic.
So a powerful idea may appeal to politicians because of its political currency. Voters want affordable or state-subsidized childcare, for instance. And as you mentioned, politicians are players, not stayers. They're there for a period of time. But when it comes to making that idea palatable to technocrats who are stayers or the DGs, the people in the departments, it must be scalable and feasible and make for good policy. Tell me about how you've been thinking about this in your work at DGMT's Change Ideas.
Well, Change Ideas is sort of a work in progress. And what I've recently been doing is looking ahead about how to strengthen the project. And the vital part of that is about external engagement. getting the policies to the right people, being very clear, and to use my current favorite word, deliberate about targeting and hunting down, in a way, the people who need to see what we do. And with change ideas, obviously a massive part of it is that the policy briefs are rooted in evidence and facts and scale of implementation. And we use data, evidence, and other country examples, for instance, to highlight the problem that we're working on and the potential impact of solutions that we can put forward. And I think what happens now is that in the foreseeable future, what Change Ideas needs to do is to actually take those policy briefs and do the relationship building and the networking with civil society and with policymakers, government officials, and to ensure that you start broadening your base. So it's not Change Ideas going out alone, but it has friends with whom you can work, and you can start looking and finding champions within government. So I believe that's kind of where we are going to be heading.
Thanks, Phylicia. And what's unique about Change Ideas that it is surfacing the well of ideas that exists in South African civil society and learning from the experiences of different organizations that are implementing programmatic interventions in communities. Tess, as we wrap up today's really insightful conversation, I want to, for the benefit of our civil society audience, get a few pointers. Tell us what you have learned about what it takes to shape public policy and perceptions.
So I think the first is be an organizer. What does that mean? Be on the streets, be connecting, building relationships, communicating with people, understanding the problem, understanding the multi-levels of the problem, but be an organizer. Be there, be available. The second is, this stuff's hard work. Building a coalition is hard work, and you've got to think about the multiple ways in which you're going to structure your coalition, how you're going to support your coalition, how you're going to resource your coalition, how you're going to coordinate, how you're going to continue to inspire your coalition members, even your steering committee members, to show up, every few weeks for your meetings or whatever, and to actually put resources behind things. Do your research. And know what's required in order to set this up, and build the thing that you need. Not everyone needs a coalition. Not everyone needs a movement. You've got to figure out what it is your objective is, and what are the strategies to get there, and do the research, the background document that helps you set up what you want to set up. And then the third thing is remain agile and remain flexible, and be able to adapt and change, and be artful, be innovative, be creative, and be inspiring. Find the anatomy of the powerful idea and really kind of build it out, flesh it out, and keep revisiting and keeping it fresh, I think is also critical.
A similar question to you, Phylicia. What advice can you share with our audience about getting political traction for the ideas?
When I used to get stuck in writing, I'd go to the top of my computer screen and I would put a question to myself, what is it that I want to say? And then I went about answering it, and then I started kind of getting rid of the writer's block. For civil society organizations, what is it that you want to do? What is it that you want to achieve? And it is deconstructing that anatomy of a powerful idea. You have to have a very clear purpose and a desired outcome. And then you have to fill in between the steps that you have to take. Practical, actionable, clear steps. I mean, we all dream, but it's distilling our dreams and our ambitions into a reality. And then systematically go about getting to your desired outcome. There are some things that will cost money. There are other things where you need to look for willing partners. And I think that just use a little quote, when they did the We Are the World recording, Quincy Jones put a sign at the door, leave your egos at the door. And I think we can take a little bit of a lesson. Put your egos aside and ask, what is it that I want to do? Or we, rather. And is that inclusivity?
Thank you both for joining me today. It's evident that civil society organizations, given their proximity to communities and given the work that they do, whether research-focused or programmatic, are a real source of powerful ideas that can shape and galvanize society. And now, over to you. Those listening to this podcast, using what you have heard today, you can try this reflective exercise. You'll need a pen and paper to write down these steps or download the takeaway sheet from our website. Write down the following questions and spend some time reflecting on them by yourself, and then share your reflections with your colleagues. Question number 1. What is your political theory of change for the problem or issue you want to address? Question number 2. A powerful idea for social change starts with a clear and compelling purpose. So, what language will you use to sell it? And question number 3. What are some of the creative ways you can use to reach the government officials and politicians you want to convince? This was DGMT's Learning Lunch. Until next time.